The woman didn't ask for help. She didn't scream. She didn't even look frightened at first. She simply walked straight toward me through the crowded terminal at Dallas/Fort Worth International Airport, wrapped both hands around my arm with surprising strength, and whispered words that made my heart stop. She told me to smile, keep walking, and act like her husband for the next 40 minutes because if I didn't, someone was going to find her before she reached the next flight. Before I could understand what was happening, she rested her head against my shoulder as if we had been married for years, while 3 men in dark jackets slowly scanned the terminal only a few yards away. I had never seen her before in my life, but something in her trembling voice told me this wasn't a prank. It was the beginning of the longest 40 minutes I would ever live through. My name is Michael Harper. I was 43 years old, a widowed father from Nashville, Tennessee, traveling to Seattle for a construction management conference that I wasn't even excited about attending. Ever since my wife, Rebecca, passed away 3 years earlier after a sudden illness, life had become a predictable cycle of work, raising my 12-year-old daughter Grace, paying bills, and pretending everything was fine. Grace was staying with my older sister for the weekend, and I had almost canceled the trip because leaving her always made me uneasy. Looking back, I often wonder whether missing that flight would have changed not only another person's life, but my own forever. The woman beside me looked to be around 34. Her name, I would later learn, was Sarah Collins. She wore a navy blue business suit, white sneakers instead of heels, and carried only a small backpack. Her blonde hair was tied into a loose ponytail that looked hurriedly done, and although she forced herself to smile whenever someone glanced our way, I could feel her entire body shaking against my arm. She never looked directly at the men behind us, but she somehow always knew where they were. She quietly explained that she had escaped an abusive marriage nearly a year earlier. Her husband had been wealthy, respected, and remarkably skilled at making everyone believe he was the victim. Every court hearing had become another opportunity for him to manipulate the system. Every attempt she made to disappear ended with someone somehow discovering where she lived or worked. She had finally gathered enough evidence to testify in a federal fraud investigation involving several executives connected to her husband's business. That morning, she had been traveling under protection to meet investigators in another state. But somewhere inside the airport, she realized she was being followed before security officials could reconnect with her after a schedule change. I wanted to ask why she had chosen me out of hundreds of travelers, but there wasn't time. She simply admitted that I reminded her of someone safe. I wore a faded wedding band I had never removed after Rebecca died, and I carried a small backpack decorated with one of Grace's handmade keychains shaped like a sunflower. She said people pretending to be dangerous rarely carried things made by children. The terminal suddenly became a stage where every ordinary movement mattered. We stopped to examine souvenir shelves we didn't care about. We laughed at jokes that didn't exist. We shared a cup of coffee neither of us wanted simply because married couples often did ordinary things together. Every few minutes, I caught reflections of the same 3 men lingering behind newspaper stands, restaurants, or charging stations. Maybe they weren't following us. Maybe Sarah's fear had convinced both of us to imagine danger where there wasn't any. Yet every instinct I possessed kept telling me not to let go of her hand. For nearly half an hour, we wandered through the airport pretending to be ordinary travelers waiting for a delayed flight. During those quiet moments, Sarah began talking about the life she once dreamed of having. She had wanted children, a small house with a vegetable garden, and weekends filled with neighborhood barbecues rather than expensive parties. Instead, she had spent years hiding bruises beneath expensive clothing while smiling through charity dinners where everyone admired the perfect couple. She confessed that the hardest part of escaping wasn't leaving the mansion. It was convincing herself that she deserved to survive. Listening to her reminded me painfully of my own grief. After Rebecca died, I had convinced myself that my life had already reached its happiest chapter, and everything afterward would simply be surviving. Grace deserved a father who laughed again, who believed tomorrow could still surprise him. Somewhere between comforting a stranger and protecting someone I had just met, I realized I hadn't truly been living either. Then, everything changed. As we approached another gate, one of the men suddenly accelerated toward us. Sarah's fingers dug painfully into my sleeve. Without thinking, I wrapped my arm around her shoulders exactly as any husband would. We kept walking without looking back. My heartbeat pounded so loudly I barely heard the airport announcements echoing overhead. The man stepped directly into our path and stared at Sarah for what felt like an eternity. Then he looked at me. I calmly apologized as though we were blocking his way, gently guided Sarah around him, and continued walking. He hesitated. Maybe he wasn't certain. Maybe he expected panic instead of normal conversation. Whatever his reason, those few seconds were enough for 2 airport police officers to appear from another corridor. Sarah subtly nodded toward them without saying a word. Within moments, the atmosphere shifted. The officers approached the suspicious men for questioning. One immediately walked away. Another began arguing loudly. The third disappeared into the growing crowd. Sarah finally exhaled for what seemed like the first time since meeting me. An investigator soon arrived and quietly escorted us into a secure office behind the terminal. Only then did I discover that Sarah's concerns had been completely justified. Federal authorities had already been tracking individuals connected to witness intimidation, and the airport surveillance footage would later become important evidence. The men following her had no legitimate reason to be there. When the door finally closed behind us, Sarah burst into tears that she had been holding back for nearly 40 minutes. She apologized repeatedly for dragging a complete stranger into something so dangerous. I told her she didn't owe me an apology. Sometimes life chooses ordinary people to stand in extraordinary places for reasons we never understand. Before we boarded separate flights, Sarah asked whether she could hug me one last time. She said those 40 minutes had reminded her that not every man wanted to control someone, and that simple kindness from a stranger had restored something she thought she had lost forever, the ability to trust. Months passed. Life quietly returned to normal, until one rainy afternoon an envelope arrived at my house. Inside was a handwritten letter and a photograph. The letter explained that Sarah had safely testified. The investigation had uncovered years of financial crimes, coercion, and witness intimidation. Several people had been convicted, and for the first time in years, she was finally free. She had started working for a nonprofit organization helping survivors rebuild their lives after abusive relationships. The photograph showed a small white house with a porch overflowing with flowers. On the back, she had written that it wasn't a mansion, but it was hers. No fear. No locks beyond what every family needed. Just peace. She also included something else. There was a framed picture of Grace's little sunflower keychain hanging beside the front door. Sarah wrote that every morning before leaving for work, she looked at that sunflower because it reminded her that hope often arrives disguised as ordinary kindness from ordinary people. Her letter changed something inside me. Instead of burying myself in work after that trip, I began volunteering with organizations supporting grieving families and children who had lost parents. Grace joined me whenever she could, and together we discovered that helping other people somehow made our own pain lighter. Rebecca had always believed the best measure of a life wasn't how much we accumulated, but how many people felt less alone because we had crossed their path. Nearly 2 years later, Grace and I were invited to attend the dedication ceremony for Sarah's new community resource center. She greeted us with the brightest smile I had ever seen. The frightened woman from the airport was gone. Standing before us was someone who had rebuilt her entire future, one courageous decision at a time. During the ceremony, she shared a story without mentioning my name. She spoke about an exhausted father carrying a backpack decorated with a child's sunflower. She said that one stranger's willingness to protect someone he didn't know had reminded her that goodness still existed in the world. She explained that courage isn't always dramatic. Sometimes courage is simply choosing compassion before asking questions. As I watched Grace listening beside me, I realized she wasn't only hearing Sarah's story. She was watching the kind of man her mother had always hoped I would continue becoming after she was gone. Life rarely announces the moments that will define us forever. Sometimes they begin with a delayed flight, a crowded airport, and a frightened stranger who reaches for your arm because she has nowhere else to turn. Most of us will never know how deeply a single act of kindness echoes through another person's future. We may never see the homes rebuilt, the families healed, or the hope restored because we chose compassion instead of indifference. If this story touched your heart, remember that the strongest people are not always those who fight the loudest. Often, they are the ones who quietly refuse to let fear have the final word. And the greatest heroes are rarely the ones the world expects. They are ordinary people who decide, in one unexpected moment, to become someone else's safe place. Before you leave, I'd love to know your thoughts. If you have ever experienced or witnessed a moment when the kindness of a stranger changed someone's life forever, share your story in the comments. Your experience may give hope to someone who needs it today. The next time you walk through an airport, a grocery store, a neighborhood park, or a quiet street in your hometown, remember that every person you pass may be carrying a battle invisible to everyone else. A smile, a helping hand, or simply choosing to stand beside someone when they need it most can become the turning point they remember for the rest of their lives. Kindness is rarely convenient, but it is always powerful. And sometimes, all it takes to save a life is being willing to hear 4 simple words. Can I sit with you?